Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 51st episode of By-The-Bywater. Wow, we had a time last time, we thank you all again. We hope you all enjoyed it. That was a glorious one-off, and now we're back to staring at each other at our computer screens. But this is just the way. This is how it is. And we've all been through various things happening, but Oriana's got the biggest one because it was very, very good that we did that episode and recorded in Portland, because shortly she won't be there anymore. So it's happening now.
One time only.
We'll just have to come to New York.
Oh, no.
Oh,
no. But yeah, it's time.
Finally a reason to go.
Time to get back to the East Coast. It's just, sometimes I'm just not a West Coast person. Neither is my husband. It's okay.
You can say you spent the time. You went through, a couple of years worth of it, and through a pandemic, and got to see what it was like. So, and everything like that. So, hey, all right, you made the effort, more than some. So, a good move back to you both. That will be coming up here in a bit. Meantime, we don't want to toot Jared's horn too much here, or do we? Because we can say that he's been getting all sorts of fun reactions on his forthcoming novel out next year. The Callies are circulating, and the goodness is happening. It's wonderful. We again promise that when the actual pre-order link goes up, we will share it, but it is not quite ready yet. But that must be a very satisfying feeling there, Jared, I have to say.
It is. It's so weird having it out there and people that I've never heard of tagging me oh, I picked it up. I'm so used to knowing who has it.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to get over that, because pretty shortly it's going to be way more people than I ever thought. Yeah, but yeah, that's the weird part. And then coming with that, of course, is the good part of oh, I love this book.
The reviews, or, the blurbs, the people who have, gotten to read it so that they can provide blurbs have been beyond enthusiastic. And that's so fucking cool.
It is really cool.
Very, very cool. In the meantime, swinging back to Oriana a bit, give her some extra cheer, because she has been on the picket lines. She has been down there fighting for writers' rights at the WGA strike. So you were just down there for a couple of days, or sort of like a quick visit?
It was a quick visit. It was originally tied to this screenwriting contest that I won, and they were doing some kind of event, and I was going to be down there for that. And then the writer's strike happened. I have a lot of vested interest in this strike ending and the AMPTP giving a fair contract, because just before the strike happened, I closed on a development deal with Warner Brothers Television, and I would like to do my part in that deal. I would like that to happen. So here's hoping that the money grubbing studio executives just kind of come with actual negotiations.
Yeah,
so
grub a little less. So
I was just going to say that.
Tiny bit, just a tiny bit,
the smallest fraction of their income, like
a couple. Just one yacht is all we're asking for, basically.
Yeah. It's a simple thing. So, and if anyone out there is complaining hey, that means the movie or the show I want isn't going to be coming up yet, it's folks, there are, centuries of culture out there waiting to be found that you haven't discovered yet. So that
just go read Middlemarch while you're waiting. It'll carry you through.
Plenty that's out there. Sure, some of it may be suddenly disappearing from services, but But
speaking
also,
of which, I do think that one form of resistance that I have seen a lot of is, writers, these pampered Hollywood writers are getting paid so much, and how dare they? And it's most, all of the TV writers I know are really, really struggling, and they are extremely talented. And the way the industry just works now it doesn't actually work. We have people who have sold TV shows going on food stamps, and that's just not okay. So, keep that in mind if you think TV writers make a lot of money. They actually don't. Hooray. Most don't.
Yes, we'll throw a couple links in the show notes for both support and also some illustrative interviews. One recently with Michael Schur, which was very, very good. Came up with a really good baseball analogy that actually really worked very well. So credit to him. And we'll also throw a link into my friend Joy Press's article in Vanity Fair with the Hollywood Teamster boss Lindsay Dougherty, I don't ever pronounce his name, who is pretty much
such a good interview.
That's an ally right there. I'm sort of like you. I want to sit down with you and have a beer or whatever. So anyway, so the good fight is being waged. More to say later. In fact, a little more to say kind of in the news, but let's get to the news. There is actually some of a mixed variety. So Jared, please go ahead and take it away.
It's been something of a quiet month in terms of direct Tolkien news in general, but in terms of adaptations, there's a lot. On the one hand, the appearance of a variety of Rings of Power cast members at an Emmys for Your Consideration event provided a number of small teases and comments about where the next season will go. Morvith Clark mentioned a life-changing experience for Galadriel as she works with the ring Nenya. Peter Mullen, who plays King Durin, hinted at more tangled problems with the ruling family. And in an honest yet still hopeful discussion, Ismael Cruz Cordova spoke frankly about the bitter racist reactions to his casting as Arondir, but also about the wider support he's received both in the production and well beyond it since then. All well and good, of course, but among other things, there's still a little problem about the plot points and writing from last season and how that will be carried over, and its flaws compounded in this one. And about that, the WGA strike has impacted numerous productions worldwide. However, per a Variety story, Amazon pushed to have the final 3 weeks of filming left on the series done without any involvement from writers or writer-producers on the series, leaving it to the directors and non-writing executive producers to handle it instead. Far be it from us, your friends here at By-The-Bywater, to humbly suggest that maybe getting the two chief showrunners out of the way of the remaining filming is in fact the best thing that anyone's done with this series as a whole at this point. And yet, yeah. Separately, in June, the Annecy International Animation Film Festival in France will be hosting a panel providing a preview of the other big adaptation coming down the pike, the Warner Brothers anime, The War of the Rohirrim, and we'll have more about that in our July episode.
Yes, we will indeed, because by the time we record our next episode, that event will have happened. We'll have a sense of it. It's slightly unclear exactly what is being involved. It sounds like it's a panel, maybe a trailer. Certainly, it could be done. They were already giving info about the actual length of the movie, which apparently was 2 hours, 10 minutes. So who knows, maybe a rough cut or something like that. But that is happening. That is intriguing. It is sort of in comparison to Rings of Power, the quiet adaptation that's been sort of ticking along with news every so often. And we'll just see what happens. And once we know more about it, and that should be the case. And again, more next time. But yeah, Rings of Power season 2 seems like it's taking some weird turns here. So it's just the whole, without knowing exactly what's going on, it's just sort of okay. The other thing I didn't bring up because it's strictly a rumor is the report going around that the equivalent of young Shelob, which I think is just absolutely hilarious. So
yeah, that feels like something that went through a weird game of telephone where I don't know, maybe we'll see some spiders at some point in a forest, and it's just gotten completely blown out of proportion.
Yeah. I will be pretty sure this is what's going to happen if there is a young Shelob, but I bet it's going to be she's been in the mountains of the Southlands, Mordor, this whole time, and it's going to be a, hey, remember this guy the entire time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, she was there. And we were all afraid of her. We just didn't talk about it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Until this very moment.
yeah.
Until right now.
My grandmother told me stories of the,
Oh my God. Yep.
Would anybody notice if there weren't writers on this show?
Look.
Well, I'm not.
It is important in general to have writers on set. I will say that much.
Yes. Can you explain why? Because people talk about this, and I don't know if everybody knows why it's important to have a writer on set.
Yes.
Very good question.
So, TV is difficult to make. You don't just write a script and then they produce, the actors say the lines exactly as they've been written in that one draft that you did, and everything is shot exactly the way. That just isn't how it works. Often, every episode of TV that you watch went through like sometimes a dozen like script drafts to get to where to what you actually see on screen. Sometimes you will get to set to shoot something and a location won't be available, and there goes your scene where they're talking about a pizza place, like they're eating in a pizza parlor, and you have constructed this metaphor about their relationship using pizza, and now it's a ramen place, and you have to completely rewrite the dialogue and maybe even the sentiment of the scene. Sometimes an actor has like injured themselves and they can't like stand and they have to be seated for their scene, and you have to rewrite that. And there are all of these minuscule changes that need to happen during production. And if you don't have a writer there, you don't have a writer like massaging the story in the way it needs to be. Or, you know, sometimes I have heard of times where a writer wasn't on set, a director made a choice to, you know, tell an actor to play the role a certain way or to play a particular emotional moment a certain way. And then that just completely derails the story for the entire season because the showrunner had a very different emotional endpoint in mind for the character. So it can really mess stuff up. I'm sure this happened a lot on The Rings of Power. I don't really know exactly how many writers they had on set at any given time. I know Succession has 2 or 3 writers on set every episode, which is quite fascinating, and I guess it gets results.
Yeah, no, this is good to remember. As you are all watching whatever you watched, you know, it's not just simply what's on the screen. You know,
yep.
that work happens. You know, and in some respects, you know, something like the Jackson Lord of the Rings things with their deep documentaries and all that gave a real sense of how that works. You know, collectively, and you know, the writing was as much a part of it. And you know, and they you know, credit to Jackson Walsh and Boyens. They were always talking about, oh yeah, we adjusted things on the fly and all that. And again, even if not every result is something that we love, and again, all we have to do is look at the Hobbit movies and go, well, the point is they were working on that and doing things with that, and it is an evolving process.
Yeah,
so
vital part of the process from beginning to end. So
yes. So
pay them.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh boy. So we will see. And yes, the comments from the actors were nice, but of course it didn't give too much away. Why would it? So we will just sort of see where it goes.
They were so. I don't know if I was just in a bad mood when I read this. I don't know. But the Morpeth Clark thing with the ring, and she's like forming a relationship with Nenya or whatever the phrasing was, where it made it seem like the ring is going to be an entity in its own right, was bananas to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I found that bizarrely irritating, and I cannot articulate why, but it was like, not all of the rings are like the Ring of Power. Like, they don't all have consciousness, right?
I guess maybe
they're going that
version,
direction. Now she's going to have like the voice of Nenya talking to her or something. And
another thing they're borrowing from the Jackson movies, right there. You know, the idea of the voice
of the ring having like a vocal presence or whatever. Yeah,
I do wonder if that feels like something that was pulled from like Harry Potter, where in the Harry Potter lore, I guess. Wands and wizards form a connection, and as they work together more and blah blah blah, like, you know, the bond becomes stronger. And but it's like
I don't need that. From this,
we have that in a different thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Still not even sure about watching the second season. I don't think so. I don't think that'll happen.
Yeah. I mean, you know, here we are. It's sort of like, you know, curiosity drove us first time around. Second time, it's like, look at that big old mountain we got to climb.
I mean,
It is.
I mean, I feel like it have to talk about
it. Are
it,
we
but also
obligated?
I will stare dully at it. We'll still do an episode. We may just have to do it based on, like, you know, summaries.
Yeah, well, there is some part of me that still hopes it can be salvaged. I cannot see how they could.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm curious to see exactly what they're going to try and do here. Yeah, that's really what it boils down to.
I don't know. It's not that I have faith in this team anymore, if I ever did, but like, some small part of me thinks like there's some good in this show, maybe.
It's worth fighting for.
I feel a little bit like Frodo looking at Gollum and being like, maybe. Maybe this twisted thing with all joy sucked out of it could be redeemed.
There we go.
This is the Sam.
So, it has a part to play.
And will this adaptation throw itself into Mount Doom? Yeah, you never know.
And we never got another Tolkien adaptation ever again.
Oh,
please.
No.
No, genuinely, in some ways, watching the first season was instructive on how not to write a long-form arc of something.
Yes.
So, it does have its part to play before that.
Tune in next time, or we will continue our complaints. But there is other stuff to talk about, and that is our main topic, which is indeed Jared's choice here, and a very interesting choice of topic was something literally I'd almost forgotten about until you suggested it back at the Portland get together. So, Jared, please do take it away.
So, we're going to talk about the Tolkien poem where someone's love dies, so they go to the realm of the dead and make such beautiful music that the Lord of the Dead lets them have their love back. No, it's not the Lay of Leithian, it's Sir Orfeo. But I have to say, I felt like a complete fool for somehow not noticing until now that the story of Baron Luthien is partly an Orpheus riff.
Well.
But moving on from my astonishing, thick-headedness, Sir Orfeo is a Middle English poem from the 13th or 14th century. The dating is a little unclear. Technically, it's a Breton lay, which is a development of older Celtic song forms. It's written in rhyming couplets, and it's short enough that you could probably perform it over a banquet or something if you really wanted to. As far as I can tell, we don't really know when Tolkien translated it, and he didn't really write about it. So unlike Gawain or Pearl or whatever, it doesn't really seem to have taken up much space in his head. So, when even Christopher Tolkien couldn't turn up any notes about it, he wasn't that Tolkien wasn't that into it.
Yeah.
There's no notes. And if you get the edition of the book that has Gawain, Pearl, and Orfeo in it, Gawain and Pearl both have these long introductory stuff about this is my father wrote such and such about it, and Sir Orfeo is a paragraph of this is the story of the actual manuscript.
Yeah.
So it sank without a ripple for him, I guess. It retells obviously the story of Orpheus, only transposed to medieval England. Instead of Orpheus, we have Sir Orfeo. Instead of Eurydice, we have Herodes. Or whatever, I don't know how to pronounce it. Instead of Hades, we have the king of the fairies. Instead of Thrace, we have Winchester, although they still call it Thrace in the poem. Which I think is interesting to me, and we can get into that later about why that is interesting to me. Orfeo and Herodes are king and queen of heavy air quotes Thrace. In addition to being king, Orfeo is still Orpheus, so he's great with a harp and singing and whatever. And one day, while out in the garden with her maids, Herodes lies down for a nap and wakes screaming. She pretty much goes mad. She's non-responsive. She's harming herself, and she has to be restrained in her bed. And it's not until her husband comes to see her that we learn what's troubling her. She's had a vision in which the king of the fairies informs her that he's going to steal her away from beneath a grafted tree in the orchard. And despite Orfeo's best efforts, like this wall of soldiers or whatever, this is exactly what happens. And Orfeo is so upset that he decides he cannot look at another woman ever again, and he leaves his steward in charge of the kingdom, puts on some sort of raggedy pilgrim garment, picks up his harp, and leaves. Because women don't exist outside of his kingdom, I guess. And he wanders for 10 years, gets grosser and grosser, plays the harp for some animals and stuff, and finally comes across the fairies who took his wife, and his wife is with them, and he's able to follow this group into the fairy realm, which is also sort of the realm of the dead, which is kind of standard for Celtic, fairy tales. And other standard, Orpheus stuff ensues, he plays so beautifully for the king that the king says he can have whatever he wants as a reward, and Orfeo says, I want that lady right there, and the king is like, but you're so gross, and she's so beautiful, it would look ridiculous. And Orfeo's like, but you promised. And I don't remember any of this from Greek mythology, so I don't know. But he gives it back, because he promised. And so Orfeo and Herodes get back to Thrace or Winchester. The story's not quite over because it's not a love story, apparently, because Orfeo has to make sure his steward is still loyal. So once that's ascertained, we get the happy ending of the steward inheriting the kingdom upon Orfeo's death. Sure. And that's the plot. And there's not really that much to it. I wanted to talk about this poem because I enjoyed Gawain and Pearl so much and thought there might be some fun Tolkien tidbits to pick up here. But honestly, I didn't have a fun time with this. It was okay. That's my hot take. It was okay. It was fine. But we can get to what I thought later. Right now, I guess I'm most curious if either of you enjoyed it. How successful is it as a poem in his translation? Obviously, I don't think any of us read Middle English, so
I did try.
Does it work for you in his version? Because I think for me, and again, I'll get into this once you guys have talked, it didn't work for me completely in his version.
No, there are certain certain rhymes and where I'm like, this rhythm is weird. It's off. These rhymes are kind of like janky,
kind of a reach.
I feel like it's not necessarily his best work, but I do find it interesting that it's a happy ending. Like that, I went into this because I hadn't read it, and I was like, oh yeah, Orpheus. And I'm waiting for the turn where the fairy king is like, okay, you can have her, but you can't like look at her until you leave fairy. And he can't resist, and that didn't happen. And I was like, this isn't actually about, it's not a love story, it's about a faithful steward and looking kind of gross. It's about promises and keeping them. Yeah. Which is very interesting to me. I have finally finished David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years, which is a really, really great book. And yes, I promise it has something to do with this. I
trust you. I trust you.
Yeah, go for it.
Where, debt originates as a promise, more or less. Contracts and our entire economy, monetary policy is built on like belief and faith. That
so
you
beautiful.
Will,
just like fairies,
right? Just like fairies. It's all made up. It's all based on belief that you will fulfill your promise, that someone somewhere will fulfill their promise and hold to their word. So it is interesting to me.
I do.
I do.
Sorry,
we
didn't mean to interrupt you. Clap your hands.
Clap. You have to keep the American economy alive. Clap your hands. Put money on those credit cards, please. Yeah. So that actually was the most interesting thing to me, and also it's just a nice little Easter egg to know that this is where. Surely the idea for the mechanism of like getting the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown came from.
Yeah, for me, what was interesting about this, there are actually a few things about this that are interesting to me. Talking first about the poem itself, I did have to remind myself a few times, and I was like, okay, all right, Tolkien didn't write this.
Yeah.
He translated it. And per Oriana's good point, the fact that it is a happy ending is, I think, even though he wrote nothing about it, explains why he was so interested. It is a small example of eucatastrophe, to borrow his own created term, about something where the turn is not disastrous, but glorious in the end. And if on a relatively smaller scale. And that really just intrigued me. Yeah, I was kept, like Oriana was saying, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. And when it did not drop, I was like,
what?
Wow, where are we going with this? So this is not really what I expected. But there's more details and things I'll go into a bit there. However, the thing that sort of leapt out at me kind of was this: we are used. When I say we, I collectively mean the culture. Let's say the last 100 years or so. In a Western / Anglo-American context, Anglo-American European, that the idea that there are these old stories and we will revamp them and we will reinterpret them. Think of all the endless stagings, modern staging, alternate stagings of Shakespeare, or things like that. Speaking of someone who borrowed from fairy tales, especially older ones like this, because he obviously did. Look at King Lear. Among other things. So, or myths, if you will. So this was an interesting example of someone creating something syncretic centuries ago, a reminder that, okay, all right, people have been revamping and readapting stories or scenarios through the lens of where they're at right then and there ever since one could do that. I mean, this is something that is not, strictly speaking, is not really a surprise to anyone who knows their art. All you have to do is look at 8 million biblical illustrations over the course of like 2,000 years, especially New Testament and all that, sort of like where it's, here it is, Jesus and whoever, but the setting is like, 15th century Italy or wherever it is.
They're wearing doublets and drinking.
Yeah. So it's a natural, it's a very natural, one could say human, or at least certainly in certain cultural contexts type thing to do this. I'm not saying it's necessarily universal, because that I think sort of speaks to questions of how societies, cultures, however defined, view things like literacy, time, the storytelling tradition, what that means. Is something carried forward, especially if something is not in a changing or accelerating society, which I think drives a lot of this in turn. This is a deep well, and I'm not going to go further down it. But it is something that, to my mind, is just very interesting. It's the type of thing that if you had told me, oh yeah, it's an ancient Greek myth and it's a Celtic fairy tale smooshed into one, I'd be like, that sounds like something I could see someone somewhere in a writer's room coming up with, or somebody in a little fanzine context doing. But no, it was some utterly unknown person 600 years ago who, wherever they were borrowing it from, and if you look up the story on Wikipedia, it indicates its own roots. It's sort of like, put it together. It's like, okay, it's sort of like, these things happen. And I think it's interesting to see in that context. There's more I could say, but I don't want to just keep going. So maybe punching back over to you, Jared. So you and Oriana more mentioned about the mechanics of the poem, or especially as translated. Is it, what would you say tonally is something that doesn't work for you in the translation, at least? So
it is the rhyme and the meter. It is. It's the lines are too short to breathe, and I think that's inherited from the original. It's they're very short lines, and the insistent rhymes are a little like, it's a bit of reach. It feels like something that he did as a very young man. It doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't have his voice the way that Gawain does in some ways. So it just feels like an extremely minor effort from somebody who hadn't yet become the artist that he would become. But I don't know. The more interesting things to me about it were not reading it, because again, it's very like sing-songy, nursery rhymey kind of stuff.
Yeah, kind of unsophisticated.
But the actual weird things about the poem itself that have nothing to do with the translation, which is like setting it in Winchester, which at the time that it was written, Winchester was the capital of what would become the Kingdom of England until, I just based on when it was moved, but it was moved relatively recently before the poem was written. So when the poem is written, the court is in London now. So setting it in Winchester puts it in the past in a very, very interesting way, where it's like Winchester is the capital not of England, but of Wessex. Right. I think, is it Wessex? So like it's setting it in a fairy tale space in a way that's recognizable to contemporaries of the poem, but not to people nowadays, unless you have a bunch of footnotes. And I don't know, I just thought that was really like a really interesting adaptational choice on the part of this anonymous poet. Like it's Orpheus, but it's using like Celtic fairy rules, and it's updated for that audience, but still very consciously put in a half legendary past. I don't know. That kind of thing was way more interesting to me than whatever Tolkien's bringing to the table on this one. Or like the symbolism, I don't know, maybe motif is a better term, of the grafted tree, which comes up a lot. Like that's where Hyodas is sleeping when she gets approached by the Fairy King, and it's mentioned a lot. And this idea of grafting, where you take a root from one tree and attach a different tree to it because it'll grow better that way. And like at the end of the poem, that's basically what happens to the royal house of Thrace. The steward is like grafted onto this thing, and it's like, I don't know if that's supposed to mean anything for the audience at the time, but as like a nice little bit of foreshadowing, I thought that was really cool.
Something that reading this led me to look into. Now, on the one hand, the you'd say the Celtic side of this poem, something about like the king of the fairies and where it exists, that's very interesting stuff in its own right, and we can certainly plunge into that. And I think there's something to be said too about how a syncretic poem like this could absolutely appeal to Tolkien, precisely because we can think about the ways in which his own education was essentially the late Victorian Edwardian education was both both self-consciously classical, but also increasingly there are people going in. It's like, what are our pasts? What is the nature of England as much as the Greco-Roman civilization to which we, the English, are clearly the heirs. Which has been sort of like an attitude throughout a fair amount of what can be called standardized 19th into 20th century education, nationalism, etc., through an English context, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots to unpack, but what I wanted to look at was in discovering how much I didn't know about Orpheus as a character, because I know the basic story, Orpheus and Eurydice. It's sort of like, okay, yeah, Orpheus he's one of the Argonauts. The thing happens with Eurydice, I suppose to pronounce it correctly. And that basic story about how, yes, brought back, and that I knew. But when I decided to, sure, it's lazy, but it's there. I'm like, what does Wikipedia say about Orpheus anyway? And now I'm like, whoa, there's a convoluted load of these weird intertwining things, and I realized how mutable a figure he was even back then. You had writers insisting that he was a real person. You had writers basically making him more like a creator of almost like a creator of almost modern history or things like this. How he talks to the animals, the inventor, and all that. He's very protean figure, and to my mind, Hercules was always the protean figure of Greek mythology to a degree, but Orpheus is kind of right up there with him, and that makes the fact that the story is mostly told through the tragedy that befalls him interesting, because it seems that he is much more of an all-over-the-place guy, for lack of a better term. In a weird way, Sir Orfeo kind of doesn't necessarily consciously reclaim that, but almost makes a case for it, saying, no, he's more than just that story. And I found that was pretty interesting. Jared, you were sort of reacting there to some thoughts. So
yeah, much earlier in what you were saying. So I'm going to loop back, I guess. Reminded me of the king and the land of the dead and fairy and all of that. And there's in the poem when Orfeo shows up at this castle where the king lives, he comes across this, basically the courtyard is just full of people who aren't dead, but aren't alive, like people who were presumed drowned or lost in fires or whatever. There are people taken on the point of death who are in this weird twilight zone. And it makes the poem very, very weird when you consider that these are the people that the fairies are taking, but they have taken his wife, who, as far as we knew, was fine. So there's this weird undercurrent of like, she was going to die, possibly, and they have taken her. By bringing her back to the realm of the living, he's upsetting the natural order in some way, like he's ending his own line because she is not alive anymore, no matter how much back she is. Which such a disturbing little undercurrent to this poem, which is never called out by the narrative itself. But yeah, this intersection of the realm of the dead with the realm of the living is where this poem kind of lives. Which
I can see Tolkien, having this hold over Tolkien, who is very concerned with death as a natural thing, or death as something that must be accepted, grappled, while also grappling with it. What does it mean? How do we deal with it? And it is interesting. The power of faery is so often in, God, what's the fancy word for lying? Artifice. It's like kind of fiction. Is it fiction, artifice? I don't know what's happening to me today. Like my brain is just mush. But the power of faery tends to lie in artifice, and death is kind of one of those things that you cannot kind of.
You can't artifice yourself out of this one.
It's you can't really put a pretty face on death. And I find that fascinating that's in this poem, that all these depictions. It's weird. It's like it's one of the weirdest depictions of faery that I've kind of encountered. I'm not a connoisseur, but like
well, it's even it does vary depending on what specific legend or myth or whatever you're looking at. But I think it is kind of significant that this version of faery, nobody is quite dead. They are people who are, I forget what the exact phrasing is, but basically they were presumed to be dead. And now they inhabit this weird twilight realm where I don't think you see anybody else who is actually dead. They're just I don't know, the ones who kind of are in between.
Right. Yeah.
So it is a little bit different. There are other versions where this is where the dead are, or not versions of this story, but other versions of Celtic faery where it is explicitly the realm of the dead, and it just makes it a little more unsettling when it's like it's not quite grappling with death. He's not getting his wife back from death.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a step too far, I think, for this poem.
Yeah.
He's getting her back, but he's getting her back from this strange liminal place, and what he gets back is kind of liminal. Like I was reading this one piece about it that pointed out that the last time she speaks is before she's taken, I think, and when she's back, you never hear from her again. The steward speaks, Orfeo speaks, and I don't think it's just that it's like she's a woman, she can't talk. It's something is missing from her, even though he has recovered her.
That's a good point. Let me read the bit actually where talking about the where Orfeo finds all these sort of half dead people, because it's one interesting too. You'll get a sense of what we're talking about and sort of the choppy, quick, simple, shall we say, nature of the rhymes in translation, but also just a sense of how just unusual the section is. So then he, being Orfeo, then he began to gaze about, and saw within the walls a rout of folk that were thither drawn below, and mourned as dead, but were not so. For some there stood who had no head, and some no arms, nor feet, some bled, and through their bodies wounds were set, and some were strangled as they ate, and some lay raving, chained and bound, and some lay in water, had been drowned, and some were withered in the fire, and some on horse in war's attire, and wives lay in their childbed, and mad were some, and some were dead, and passing many there lay beside, as though they slept at quiet noontide. Thus in the world was each one caught, and thither by fairy magic brought. There too he saw his own sweet wife, Queen Herodes, his joy in life, asleep beneath a grafted tree. By her attire he knew 'twas she. So you can get a sense of how this is not one of his most complex translations. It's sort of like da 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 and all that. But it's a weirdly vivid, and currently, I like how he says, or I should say, he's the poet, and some were dead, but not all.
I had forgotten that.
It's
that
weird.
line, but
it's really weird, and I do think I personally sometimes forget that, like, I don't know, sometimes people just like wrote things that don't make sense sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not everyone, just because it's old doesn't mean like, oh, well, this is very specific and like intentional. It's like, I don't know, maybe you just forgot.
Building at this stage in Western literature.
They might have been being paid by the word, but they needed to fill out the page.
Right? It just kind of sounds cool, so I'm going to say this. Like, I think that might be what happened here.
It's entirely possible.
I do wonder, thinking about where this translation came from, is it's sort of something that it could well be something that he did either as a younger student as almost like an exercise, just to be able to say he could do it, and one reason why he didn't spend more time. It's like, okay, there, I've done it. Or maybe it was used as some equivalent of a teaching aid in one of his classes. However, the description from Christopher indicates, there are no associated notes or anything like that, which would probably more indicate if he was using it in a class context for instruction. So it's sort of like, it renders the odd little mystery of why this poem to a degree. But looping back maybe on sort of Orpheus as a figure and all that, it's interesting how the Orpheus legend has become, especially the more sorrowful read on it, for lack of a better term, has become the standard one as opposed to this rather hopeful one here. It's come down that way, and how that's interpreted, as I'm sure Oriana is thinking of, and I will pitch off to her. It has recently been a thing in Broadway, thanks of course to the musical derived from the album Hadestown, which I do not know if you're a fan of or anything, but if you happen to know it more than I, and I only barely know a bit about it, would you mind explaining it to our listeners who might not be aware of it?
Yeah, I never actually ended up seeing it because it came out just before the pandemic, I think, and tickets were impossible to get. It was another kind of not quite Hamilton situation, but kind of. And then we moved.
Hamilton for the art school crowd.
Yeah. But I do love the the original cast recording that was like before it actually hit Broadway. That's actually my favorite recording of it. Anyway, I really enjoyed the recording of it, at least. And I have seen clips, and it is like a really, it's the sad version. But it is, hopeful, and yep, it's great.
Well, maybe if this helps as a hook, and it's another example of how the story can be, how the basic story can be used and grafted onto different contexts. So we have Sir Orfeo with something more in a backward-looking medieval context in a medieval time, as Jared was noting there, whereas Hadestown is sort of like, you could say it's, I don't want to say entirely backward-looking, because American capitalism is what it is, but it is essentially an industrial capitalist nightmare scenario that they find themselves in, and we're meant to sort of see it through this realm of how an ancient myth can be something, fed into this particular context and have a resonance that way.
Yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, it sort of reminds me of Total Recall, like the Paul Verhoeven original, Recall, in that we have this underclass of laborers who are oppressed and, by this one horrible man. Although, in Total Recall, the man does not learn to like sort of reconcile with his own wife, which is very much a really interesting, cool theme, where Hades and Persephone, like a lot of it actually, it revolves around their marriage in Hadestown and how much Persephone resents him, and but it's like Hades wasn't always like this, and it's sort of like marriage counseling through Orpheus's song almost.
Really? I've never listened to it, so
I really, really enjoy it. It's worth a listen. I know, I thought everyone loved this, but I was talking with someone a few months ago in LA who was like, it's just like the staging is just so amateurish and like black box theater, and I was like, oh no, okay.
I just think it's interesting just to have something, and this would hove off into a whole area, so we'll just keep it at this, to have something after all the jukebox musicals we've gotten, something was actually created as a musical from an album that someone wrote and created specifically as a song cycle. So it's like, oh, well, that's a little different, so credit to them. We'll throw in links and show notes there as we go. Maybe something, though, to talk more about, I mentioned Eucatastrophe, something of the details where Tolkien would have really, this is the part here that actually, in the story, in the poem, that makes me most think of something that Tolkien would do, even though, again, he did not do it. He's translating. And yet this is sort of like, okay, this is the ground level thing that I think Tolkien can be good at more than once, as opposed to living on the heights as he has, I think, Pippin say at one point in Return of the King. So it's about how how the King of Fairies having released Herodotus, the two of them now make their way back. And again, no need to worry about looking behind them. They can barely do that as much as they want. And just keep walking and talking or whatever. Long was the road, the journey past. To Winchester he came at last, his own beloved city free, but no man knew that it was he. Beyond the town's end yet to fare, lest men them knew, he did not dare. But in a beggar's lowly cot, but in a beggar's narrow cot, a lowly lodging there he got, for himself and for his wife, as a minstrel poor of wandering life. He asked for tidings in the land, and who that kingdom held in hand. The beggar poor answered well, and told all things that there befell. And I like that, is the best way to put it. It's something that, we are, stories like this, generally speaking, are stories of, the high and mighty, let us say, everything else is sort of like, there's down in other context or looked down on, sometimes very consciously. If you want to bring George R. R. Martin into this, the idea is that, the occasional reference to the small folk, because it's sort of like, oh yeah, whatever. Here is something that actually sort of like, that grounds the idea sort of like that the beggar has a role to play. It's something that's sort of like, oh yeah, please, I can't give you much, but here's this. He doesn't. The poem does not dwell on this, but I like this little moment of something like, yeah, if you had told me it was a Tolkien original, that might be the moment that tells me it's a Tolkien original. It's not necessarily something new he would have created himself or anything like that. I'm not saying that there isn't anything like that before in literature. Far from it. But it's the type of thing I can sense him doing. It's the type of the touch that I can sense him doing thing where it's sort of like, just sort of, rather than it being a thing, it's sort of like, hey, just sort of down here and what's going on, and just sort of having to deal with the events that are way above everyone's head. And I think that's just an interesting touch. I'm not saying this is what drew him to the poem by any means. Again, without any context, we have no idea. But it's something that almost makes more sense for him than anyone else translating it. So
yeah, there's also speaking of eucatastrophe, from the point of view of the steward, it's like, this beggar shows up and is like, oh yeah, Orpheus got torn apart by wild animals and I found his harp. And the steward is like, oh no, that sucks. Like, my beloved master is dead, and he has a fainting fit and whatever. And then, this gnarly beggar is like, actually, I'm Orpheus. I was just testing you to make sure that you weren't trying to seize my kingdom in my absence. And,
he accepted the return of the king.
Yeah. I mean, again, eucatastrophe from his point of view, where it's like this, the most horrible thing is, no, this is joyful. Yeah. The master's back, which, I don't know. I also think that feels very Tolkien to be like, let's leave the woman where she was, and give the men an emotional resolution.
Right. And also it is funny, even in their journey back, Tolkien uses he. It's like there's no collective. It's like he leads her away and he finds the path. He retraces his steps, and she doesn't figure in it all. There's no no they to be found.
Yeah, which again, to me, I mean, part of that could just be the misogyny of the text. Yeah, but also the fact that she becomes a non-entity as soon as she is taken.
She's a MacGuffin. She is the MacGuffin of this poem.
But in more whatever he gets back is not a full person in the way that she was before. Yeah.
Almost.
So he doesn't have to look back and lose her because she's still lost.
That's grim, man.
Yeah, well, maybe I have been depressed this week. I don't know.
Oh, dear. I mean, something that occurred to me just thinking about it is her moment of when she suddenly has this vision and is overwhelmed in its own way. It's almost sort of like someone trying to account for if somebody suddenly has, quote unquote, an episode, let's say. So, and you can cast that as broadly as you will. It's almost sort of an interpretation of what happens when someone sees something so horrifying or has something in their brain and how they're conveying it. I'm not saying that is what the original poet was intending, but it's an interesting way to sort of interpret it. It renders the mystery of how she is eventually taken away all that much more quietly terrifying, because it's just one of those things like, how could something like this seemingly happen out of nowhere? And ultimately, no real cause or explanation for it exists. It just is. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like what happens when you deal with something that's implacable and yet are somehow able to make something out of it. That's great, but that also emphasizes the fact that this is not quite the world we know. It is something very, very strange. And maybe on that level, thinking more about one of the things that sort of signifies, I'm sure, to the audience that that where the king of the fairies is of the castle is so unusual and strange is the description about how it's a totally flat plain. Mm-hmm. That there's no mountains, there's nothing recognizable geographically. It's just
weird. It's Florida.
Yeah. Everything makes sense now. King of the Fairies is just the worst Florida man there ever was. I knew it. Coming here and ruining lives elsewhere. It's like, okay, all right, thanks, dude.
Human trafficking? Oh my God.
Now that's getting dark.
Right?
And we were talking about this being a more hopeful version of the story. Maybe not.
Is this like the origin of Taken? Like the Taken trope?
The Secret came out, so
Except
Liam Neeson was reading poetry one day.
We should like.
Oh, that's sweet. Musical version of Taken when. Right?
Give it time. They're doing it with everything else. So Disney version of Taken. It can happen. So, well, let's see. I think we've said what we need to say really about this one. It is certainly a minor work, but it's a good thing to reflect on. If nothing else, it just reflects, Tolkien's interest in a lot of things, and this falls within his bailiwick, and he made the effort on it, and it's a very tiny little thing, and at the same time, there's stuff going on there, stuff to reflect about. I'll end there. What do you guys? Any final thoughts from either of you two?
If you do find yourself interested in the Middle English version, just look for one on the internet that Tolkien kind of recopy. And like, I don't know, it's just kind of fun to try and pick your way through. For me, I don't know if anyone else is interested in that kind of thing, but...
Yeah, there are versions you can find that are well footnoted and point out a lot of historical context for the stuff that's going on. I will say I'm having a sort of a similar reaction to this that I had to Gawain, where it's like, it's interesting for the impact that it doesn't seem to have had on his work. Even though, so with Gawain, like he wrote so much about Gawain, but it doesn't seem to have really changed how he himself wrote, this kind of like very artificial structure of promises and like the very fairy tale feeling that both of them have. After he worked on these things, was he like, I'm done. I know this isn't what I want to do. Sort of a negative influence in a way, despite some of the similarities that exist.
And it is time to look ahead to the topic for the next episode. The choice of topic has come back around to me. So, speaking of strikes, this is something that we were going to do when it came out last fall, but a strike got in the way then. That strike, of course, was resolved successfully, so credit to the HarperCollins folks who were able to get that one great deal. But with that settled, that means we can now talk about what came out, which is the quote-unquote new Tolkien book, not really, that came out last fall, The Fall of Numenor, edited by Brian Sibley. It is a collection of things, and nothing in it is really new, but what did bring up a lot of interesting contrasts and things that I hadn't thought about before, or hadn't thought about in a long while. And as a contrast to a certain Amazon TV series that was running at the same time, it was nice to read what the author actually wanted to happen. So illustrations by Alan Lee, etc. It is easily out there at this point. I'm sure you can probably find it if you want to get it for fairly cheap at this rate. If not, check your local libraries. But that is what we will be talking about next time, taking a look at that. Any last things before we wrap up here from anyone? Except, of course, good luck as Oriana prepares for remove and all that other fun stuff.
Yeah.
Woo! Which, like, our next... our next
solidarity.
Recording will be, like, right as we're packing.
You'll hear her taping up boxes as we go. So, and yes. Solidarity to all the WGA folks and everyone out there, especially if some of the other unions, as could be the case, start looking ahead, doing striking themselves.
SAG has
already made...
Some of this is going to be old news by the time
right?
So
we'll have to see. So, who knows? Maybe something transformative will have happened. Wouldn't that be nice? So, as always...
I would love a win.
Let there be more of it. So, so power to everybody. Thank you again very much for listening. In terms of our social media, you can find us on Twitter or wherever we might be. And, of course, there's always the main page at megaphonic.fm/by-the-bywater. There's also our Patreon that you can use to support Megaphonic and join our Discord, which we encourage you to do. It's a fun place. Talk about Tolkien and talk about many other things besides, including, of course, material that ties in with the other podcasts on the Megaphonic network, which reminds me of a point. Listen in for the new/old, if you will, because it's one of our wonderful co-hosts, Mikey Collins, who is doing his new podcast series, Mug Up, which is an interview series with many different folks, and that will be starting with Jared, who will be one of the first guests he's recording tomorrow, and that episode should be dropping around the same time this episode drops. So basically, go to the Megaphonic FM homepage to find out more, and donate. Come on. Patreon's there. We love you for it. It's not that expensive, and it's really, really fun. Thank you again very much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. Until then.